Hello, and welcome to this lesson. In this lesson, you'll be learning how to generate a new Angular application, the project's folder structure, how to install and wire third-party node packages, and how to run the application on your local machine. To generate a new Angular application, we'll need to use the ng-new command. So for my case, I'm going to type in ng-new and then the name of the application that I want to build, and we'll call this one Hello World. When you're prompted with whether or not you want to add routing, we're going to say no for now, and then we're just going to use the default CSS. Once you get a message that the packages were installed successfully, we just want to verify that the folder and project was actually created. And to do that from the CLI, I'm just going to type in ls. If I was on a Windows machine, I would type in dir. As you can see, we have this folder called Hello World. So we'll go ahead and cd into that folder. So I'll say cd hello world. Now that I'm in this folder, I'm going to do another ls just to make sure that all the files and directories and things were created. And it looks like they are. So the next thing I want to do is I want to install Bootstrap and jQuery, which are two third-party tools, and they'll add a little bit of styling to our application. So I'm going to say npm install Bootstrap and then jQuery. Once those packages are installed, we can go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code to see what was generated for us. And to open up a new solution, you really just need to go to File, and then you're looking for the open folder, and then you just navigate to the project that was just created. So before we get into the actual folder structure of this new project we just created, there's a couple things we need to do first. First, we want to wire up the two third-party libraries that we just installed on the application, and to do that, we're going to open up the angular.json file. Inside the angular.json file, you're going to see two sections. One section is called styles, and another section is called scripts. The styles section, as the name suggests, is where you would add any kind of third-party CSS style sheets that you want to add to your application. And then the script section is going to be for any kind of third-party JavaScript files that you want to add. So since we added Bootstrap, we need to add Bootstrap as an entry into the styles array. If you're not sure on the exact path, all you would need to do is open up the node modules directory and then navigate to where that third-party library was added, and then you just paste that into here. So really all we're telling the CLI is this is where you'd want to look to be able to install or to be able to reference any of those libraries or tools that we're adding to our application. So now that I've added the CSS one, I'm going to go ahead and open up the scripts array and add two entries, one for Bootstrap and one for jQuery. Okay, with those added, we can go ahead and start exploring the folder structure of our application. So the first thing you're going to notice is going to be a folder called src. That is going to be the source directory where all of our files and things are going to be created. And you'll notice that there is an app folder and there's an assets folder. The assets folder is where you're going to store any kind of assets that are associated with the application that you're working on. In this case, they could be images, they could be any kind of data files, or any markdown files that you might want to include in your application. The next directory is going to be the app directory. The app directory is where all the main files for your application are going to be stored. So when I use the CLI and I start creating new files in my application, those files are going to be added to the app directory. You'll notice there's a file called app.module.ts file, and this is going to be the main module for your application. This is where all of the components you create are going to be embedded or are going to be referenced at. The next one you're going to see is an app.component.ts file. This is going to be the main file for the app component where we write any kind of JavaScript logic for our application. Now, this is Angular, and so we are using TypeScript. So instead of writing specific JavaScript code, we're going to be writing TypeScript code that gets transpiled down into JavaScript code. But either way, the actual logic, the business logic that we're going to be working with in our application will be written in the .ts files. Next, you're going to see a app.component.html file. This is the file where we would write any HTML code specific to the component we are working with. In this case, we are working with the app component, so the app component is going to contain an HTML file, it's going to contain a .ts file, and it's going to contain a .css file. These three files make up the functionality and behavior of the app component. The last one that we talked about is going to be the app.component.css file, and this is where you'll have any custom styling that you want to apply specifically to the app component. So as we're working on our Angular applications and we start creating new components, each of those new components we create are going to include a .css file, a .html file, and a .ts file. And again, the CSS file is going to be for all of your styling. The .html file is going to be for any kind of specific HTML code that you want to write in your application. And then the .ts file is going to be for any business logic or functionality that you want to create in your application. Now, I know I'm talking a lot about components, and you may or may not know what components are. Basically, Angular is a component-based architecture, and what that means is everything in Angular you create is going to be based on components. Components could be anything from buttons, they could be drop-down menus, they could be menu items, they could be data tables, lists, really anything that a user would interact with or things that are reused throughout your application. Angular has a principle that says basically when you're creating items in your application, we should create those as components. By creating them as components, we can reuse them throughout our entire application. So like I said in my example, if I have a button and I want to add special styling, I want to add some kind of state behavior, so when I hover over it, the styling changes colors, or when I click it, there's an animation for that button. All of those would be associated with a single component. And then that single component can be reused throughout your entire application. So if I have a separate CSS file, I can apply all of my CSS styling to that button. The HTML code would contain all of the HTML specific code for a button. And then the .ts file would contain any kind of behavior for that button that a user can interact with. So now that I've added all of my libraries to my angular.json file, we want to go ahead and run the application. And to do that, I can either open up a terminal window through VS Code, or I can open up a command line interface in my operating system that I'm working with. In my case, I'm just going to open up the terminal window. I'll just expand this so it's easier to see. And then down below is where you would type in your command to start the application. Since this is going to be an Angular application, we want to type in ng-serve. What this will basically do is it will transpile all the code that we've written into native JavaScript and HTML code, and then it'll bundle everything together so that we can actually view it in a browser. Once everything has been compiled, you should see a message down below that says Angular Live Development Server is listening on localhost 4200. Open your browser and view the application. So we'll go ahead and open up a browser. And we'll navigate to localhost 4200. So I'll say localhost 4200. And if you've done everything correctly to this point, you should see code and should see your application in the browser. Now everything you see on the screen is going to be the pre-built, pre-generated code that comes with the CLI when you create new applications. We're actually going to make modifications to this and build our own little custom web page just to get up and running and get familiar with Angular and how things work in the Angular application. So I'm just going to go back to our Visual Studio Code. We want to find the app.component.ts file, and if you remember from my explanation, that is where you're going to contain all of your logic for your application. Now, if you notice, there's already a variable defined named title, and what we want to do is we just want to change that to a variable called myWorld, and then we want to assign it a string value of you're now in your name's world. And so I'm going to say you are now in Professor Crasso's world. And then we can go ahead and remove the other entry that we had in our application. Now, if you've been looking down below, you'll notice that there's some actions going on in the browser window. And what that basically is every time we make changes to our application, we have live reloading. So in other words, when I make a change to my application, my Angular application, it's going to automatically reload, recompile everything, and so I can view it in real time in the browser. You're also going to notice that there's an error now. You can see it says source app.component.html property title does not exist on type app component. Well, that makes sense, right? Because we had that variable that we just removed from our application. And so now that we've recompiled and transpiled our application, Angular is saying, hey, you're referencing a variable inside the HTML code that does not exist. And that's okay because we're going to make a change to that in just a second. And we're going to actually output our variable that we just created. So we know when we want to modify HTML code, we go to the .html file for that component. So I'm just going to open up the HTML code. I'm going to get rid of all of the pre-generated code that comes with the CLI. So we'll just delete all that. And we're going to create just a nice little bootstrap navigation bar and then a main body where we can output our message. So I'm going to say nav, and then I'm going to give it a class of nav bar, and then nav bar expand. And then small, we'll give it a background color of dark, and then nav bar, we'll call it dark. Okay, so inside this navigation, we're going to have a couple items, and that's going to be for all of our menu items that we're going to be working with or clicking in the application. So we're going to have 3. We're going to have home, about, and contact us. So we'll create an unordered list. We'll give it a class, and then we'll just say nav bar nav. And then inside here, we're going to have, like I said, a couple list items. So we'll have a list item. This list item will need to have a class, and then we'll give this class of nav item. And then we want this to be the active one, so we give it an active class. And then inside here, we're going to create an anchor tag. We'll give this a class of nav item. Nav link. And then we're going to give it a value of home. Now I just add a little href here, and that really just going to give it a hashtag, so it's not going to navigate anywhere. So this is going to be basically our basis for our menu items. So what I can do is I can just copy and then paste this, because these are going to stay the same. We'll need to remove the active entry for each of them. And then we need to remove the values. So this is going to be contact us. And this is going to be about. So, as I said before, down below, it's rerunning, it's retranspiling, it's regenerating our Angular application. So if we go back over to our browser, we should see our navigation bar in the browser. And if you look, we do. We have 3 links: home, about, contact us, which is what we just created. With our nav bar completed, we'll go ahead and create another main section. And this section is going to be a column. It's going to be 1 row with 12 columns. So I'm going to say div, and then we'll give it a class of container. And then inside this container, we're going to have another div, and this class is going to be a row. And inside this row, I'm going to have a div and a class, and this is going to be a 12-column div. So we say column small 12. Now, just to test this to make sure everything is okay, let's go ahead and add a title. So we'll give this a title, and we'll put that above our row. So we can say H2, and we're going to say exercise 1.2 hello world. Again, let's go ahead and save it, and let's hop back over to our browser to see what changes we've had, what changes we did, what they look like. Oh, you can see we have now this message here that says hello world. Now notice how it's right up against this navigation bar. So what we want to do is maybe give it a little bit of spacing so that it actually looks neat. So to do that, I can actually add 2 breaksum or line spaces in the application. So I can say BR, and then I can add another one like this. Now, if I save and go back to the browser, notice how the actual title, it has a little bit of space between the top and the bottom of it. Sure, there's probably different ways you can do that, but this is just the easiest way to get some spacing from the top navigation bar and our main body content. So we'll go back to our actual VS Code, and we'll continue writing the rest of this. So like I said, I want to have a div section where I can display that message, that variable message that we created in the .ts file. And so I'm just going to create a simple alert. And then inside this, I'm going to output the message. So I can say strong because I want to have the first letter or the first word message to be bolded. And then after that, I want to just have the regular message that we're going to be displaying. To display messages or display values from your TypeScript code, we need to use 2 sets of curly braces. As you can see here, we need to have 2 curly braces, and this is basically tells Angular that I want to utilize some variable or some value from the .ts file for this specific component. And so in our case, we want to say my world. Now if I click save, we go back over to our browser, we should see our message in an alert box. And as you can see here, we have an alert box, which is green, which is the success class for Bootstrap, with our message that is bolded, and it says you are now in Professor Crasso's world. So just to kind of hit this point home, if we go back to the .ts file, which is where we define that variable, we can make a change. So let's say you are now in Richard's world. Hit save. Go back over to the file, and it says you are now in Richard's world. So the general idea is that when you create variables or you create values or you define things inside of your .ts file, to access and display those, you need to use the double curly braces. And that's going to be specific to the HTML file associated with that component. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If I was to create, let's say, a different component, and I call that component about. If I tried to access the my world variable in the app.component.ts file, I couldn't do that. So just to make it a long story short, what we really want to do is make sure that if we're defining variables or we're trying to interact with code, we want to keep everything contained into that component. So these are not global variables, they're variables specific to the components that you're creating. To recap, in this lesson we covered how to generate a new Angular application, the artifacts that make up an Angular application, and how to run a simple project on localhost 4200. In our next lesson, we'll be exploring the basics of TypeScript through a simple project. Thank you for watching.